On October 20th, 2011, international news outlets such as Al Jazeera and the BBC broadcast video footage of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya, being beaten and shot by crowds of revolutionaries in Sirte. The uprising was part of a larger, sweeping cultural event that would become known as the Arab Spring, which several countries in the Middle East and North Africa attempted to or succeeded in overthrowing their dictatorships in favor of democratic governments. Wider protests spread across the Arab world, forcing leaders to crack down heavily on their own people. Overall, rather than establishing democratic governments, ISIS used the opportunity to gain a significant influence in countries like Iraq, Syria, and Libya, using the instability caused by the wars that followed the Arab Spring. During the final day of Gaddafi's life, accounts differ on where or when he was shot, and it is unclear when exactly he died in the midst of the chaos. Some of the footage shows the bleeding Gaddafi seemingly alive, loosely grasping to life. He was said to have asked one of his captors before he died, "What did I do to you?" He was killed only a few miles from the village he was born in. Gaddafi first came to power in 1969 in a nearly bloodless coup of the government of the previous leader, Saad Idris. Idris had been appointed the king of Libya in 1959 following a 1949 UN resolution, which failed to consider the longevity of his leadership as a cause for concern. Idris had no immediate heir and had aligned himself loosely with Western governments during the 1950s and 60s. Gaddafi led the 1969 coup with the intention of giving Libya a stronger sense of national identity, restoring conservative Muslim values to society, and cutting ties with the West. At the time, the Soviet Union and NATO countries were fighting to preserve their influence in the Middle East and North Africa. As outlined in a July 1970 CIA report, following the military coup of Muammar Gaddafi's Revolutionary Command Council, or the RCC, in September 1969, the Libyan government stopped receiving military aid and equipment from Britain and switched to the USSR directly and through Egypt as their primary supplier of military equipment. The British had primarily been supplying Libya to aid in its defense from Egypt, but Gaddafi's new government was not hostile to Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, so the British saw no use in further arming the Libyan military. The Libyan government made it clear that they still wanted to receive supplies from the United States despite U.S. policies regarding Israel, which was and still is one of the primary reasons Arab countries are hesitant or resistant to dealing with the United States and its allies. Nasser's positive relationship with the new Libyan government seemed motivated by the desire to benefit from Libya's massive oil reserves, the largest on the continent. These oil reserves had been discovered during the reign of King Idris I, but he had not been able to put them to use in time to save his government. Nasser is noted to have advised Gaddafi on which governments to deal with and who to trade with, and to keep the French friendly for as long as possible while turning to the USSR for assistance. The USSR also seemed eager to make a deal with the Libyan government to ensure its cooperation. The CIA was likely not concerned about Libya becoming a communist state from Russia's influence due to the way Nasser was advising Gaddafi to keep the USSR at arm's length also, and Gaddafi's anti-communist policies in Libya. By working closely with and imitating Nasser, Gaddafi was able to bring wealth to Libya through its oil deposits. Nasser was also able to influence others in the region, such as Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Hafez al-Assad in Syria. Families grew wealthier across Libya as more and more jobs were linked back to the state through infrastructure projects and the construction of hospitals and schools. This was all funded by Libya's trade of oil. Various agencies began to take hold of Libya's government, managing the projects and keeping his own influence in the everyday function of Libya. This way, Libya's economy would not be able to function without Gaddafi's influence running all the way to its roots. The family of Majdi al-Mangush were privileged enough to find stability under Gaddafi, being elevated to a middle-class lifestyle. Following the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Gaddafi began trying to come across as less brutal than Saddam, both to his people and the West, having seen the Western response to the actions of Saddam's regime. Gaddafi tried to distance himself from being similar by getting rid of his embassy programs and armaments, providing information to them in their search for al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Gaddafi knew that he would be next up for invasion and deposition if he did not cooperate with the West, and his actions in the early 2000s reflected that fear. However, as Majdi al-Mangush would put it, none of it was ever actually intended to benefit the people of Libya. It was entirely for Gaddafi to save himself from the West. When Gaddafi first took power, it looked like Libya might be headed for economic prosperity and stability. However, throughout his 40-year rule, Gaddafi would become heavily reliant on police and military control of the civilian population, tightening his grip on unrest in Libya. Gaddafi made an effort to have his picture plastered all over the country, just as other authoritarian leaders would do. The governments of Syria, Iraq, and Libya all became increasingly suspicious of their own people, carrying out brutal acts of violence to preserve their control of the states. Gaddafi's primary concern when dealing with unrest in his country was between various southern tribes far from the northern coastal cities that made up most of Libya's population. He would make alliances with some of the groups by giving them positions in governmental organizations. Public criticism of Gaddafi was unheard of and would be enforced by the Libyan security forces. This escalated through the turn of the century until it reached its breaking point in the spring of 2011. The Libyan people had reached such a state of distrust and fear with their government that when protests broke out across the Arab world in 2011, they joined in. On January 4, 2011, Mohamed Bouazizi sparked a series of protests across the world with his immolation, beginning in Tunisia and spreading quickly to Egypt, Libya, and other Arab states. Majdi al-Mangoush was a cadet in the Libyan Air Force Academy when the first protests broke out in Misrata on February 19, 2011. Gaddafi addressed the Libyan people regarding the protests 3 days later in his Zenga Zenga speech, which seemingly gave Libyan security forces the permission they were looking for to fight back against the crowds.
وأنا أراه معمر قذافي قائد أممي. أنا دافع عني الملايين. أنا سنوجه نداء للملايين من الصحراء إلى الصحراء. وسنزحف أنا والملايين لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر. بيت بيت، دار دار، زنقة زنقة، فرد فرد، حتى تطهر البلد من الدلسي والإرجاس. لا يمكن نسمح لليبيا تضيع بين يدينا بدون مبرر في غوط الباطل. من يسمح بهذا؟ أنا معي الملايين ومعي الله الذي نصرني على القوة العظمى الكبرى.
Majdi was in a difficult position as a cadet, not technically in the military, and was not allowed to know what the protests were about. The soldiers around him defending the academy, quote, clearly didn't trust them, and the cadets stayed for nearly a week in the compound before Libyan special forces evacuated them via buses. The situation in Libya rapidly escalated in mid-February 2011, and within several days the unrest shifted to Human Rights Watch calling for the removal of Gaddafi through Western intervention. Their first report calls for the Libyan government to conduct an investigation about the first killings of the protesters on the 15th in Benghazi, and more on the 17th in Baida, Zentan, and Derna. The next day, February 18, 2011, Human Rights Watch wrote again about more killings done by the Libyan security forces, but this time includes a single line that stands out. Muammar Gaddafi had ruled Libya for 41 years. This line alone suggests that a massive shift has occurred. It reveals just how large the scale of the revolution is. Sarah Leah Whitson stated on February 20th that a potential human rights catastrophe is unfolding in Libya as protesters brave live gunfire and death for a third day running, which confirms the international recognition of the atrocities in Libya and the war that is coming. All these reports were meant to alert the Western world of the crimes of Gaddafi's regime so that they could be stopped before more lives were lost. Before Majdi al-Mangoush was able to figure out what had actually happened in Libya and across the wider Middle East and North Africa, he was selected by a superior officer to serve as an intelligence officer tasked with investigating potential rebel leaders and figuring out who they were. He was told to go to Misrata, his hometown. Majdi knew that what he was asked to do could lead to the deaths of his friends and neighbors, who he knew could potentially have been fighting for the rebel forces. The Libyan government had fed him a narrative while he had been at the Air Force Academy and living in Tripoli that the attacks were from Libyan traitors and mercenaries supported by the West. Majdi believed the claims when NATO bombers began targeting government buildings in mid-spring. When he arrived in Misrata, he was taken by a local to his home, disguised as a deserting soldier and reinforced by his name, Mangoush, which was well known in the area. The town was nearly unrecognizable, having been besieged by rebel and government forces alike. At his home, he learned of his parents leaving for Tunisia, and that much of his family and all of his friends had joined the rebellion. He learned over the next several days of the lies he had been told by Gaddafi's men, and that the revolution was led by the people of Libya. He decided that instead of truthfully reporting back to his intelligence contact or abandoning him altogether, he would stage an arrest to make it look like he had been captured by the revolutionaries. Majdi effectively defected back to his family, but still feared repercussions from Gaddafi's government. He considered moving to Tunisia, as his parents had done, but as he was preparing to join the attack on the capital, the fighting ended. After months of violence and killings in the 8-month Libyan Civil War, Gaddafi was cornered near the town of his birth, Sirte, on October of 2011. NATO bombings had ravaged the country, and Gaddafi loyalists were surrounded in the city when Gaddafi ordered the evacuation of a convoy from the city. From where Majdi was posted, he could see the bombings taking place. The convoy was hit badly by NATO bombs, and revolutionary militias fell upon the wounded vehicles. Gaddafi was shot sometime in this period, potentially wounded in the crossfire or after his capture. He died of his wounds in Sirte on October 20th, 2011.
Well, you talk about the international community's fear of a bloodbath, as you put it, and of course the international community has insisted that it's on military standby purely for humanitarian reasons. Do you support that, or do you think that there could be other agendas at play here?
There's always the major three agendas with American foreign policy we've seen in the past century, and that is we want stability. Gaddafi was all right for us for 42 years. He was what Reagan called the madman of the Middle East. All those problems we had with him. But by gosh, that oil is going, and it's going to our allies, France and Italy, and we have a cut into that. So that's fine. Stability we've had with that, with Gaddafi. That's what we need. Secondly, we need a friendly power there for maybe some use of military bases. You know, we have 800 bases in 130 countries, and that would be nice. But in the case of Gaddafi, we don't need that in Libya, rather, because we've got enough around the region. But the third thing that we need is a government there that will support Israel, or at least keep quiet about Israel, that will not join the resistance, that will not make problems with Camp David, and that's a requirement. So whatever government goes in there, that's what we're going to be there to try to assure.
Following the end of the revolution, the Transitional National Council began offering money to revolutionary fighters who had gone against Gaddafi. Libya fractured into various rebel groups, tribes, and criminal gangs, who all began to fight each other for power. In 2012, a CIA compound and the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi were attacked by some of these fighters, who killed the U.S. ambassador to Libya and 3 other U.S. personnel. Majdi even received a meaningless diploma from the non-existent Air Force Academy, showing just how deep the lies of the new transitional government ran. The new government was not accomplishing anything, and Libya had been unable to recover itself following the revolution, despite what Majdi had hoped and believed. Majdi al-Mangoush re-enrolled at university, trying to actually learn the engineering skills he had originally set out to learn. In the years after, the UN unsuccessfully attempted to establish a permanent democratic government in Libya. The people of Libya, once empowered by the idea of a brighter future without Gaddafi, were now unsure of the trajectory of their war-torn country. ISIS forces had taken the opportunity to get a foothold in the country, as they had in Syria, Egypt, and Iraq during their respective uprisings and civil wars.
Do we have a strategy for Libya, or are we just acting in an ad hoc fashion, which has been the case as we've watched ISIS establish, metastasize, and grow in Libya?
Well, as indicated, the two strategic objectives that we do have for Libya is to assist the
I know the objectives. Do we have a strategy?
To continue to support that right at this point in time. I am not aware of any overall grand strategy at this point.
The immediate post-Gaddafi era for Libya brought more violence and instability. The unrest in Libya would continue on for the next decade, with the country still unstable in 2025 and skirmishes continuing in various cities across the country. The UN Security Council has attempted to mediate discussion between the current 2 rival governments, but so far have been unsuccessful. The Arab Spring in Libya may have done a relative good of overthrowing Gaddafi's authoritarian regime, but it was not successful in establishing a democratic government as the people of Libya had hoped. Even with what Majdi had regarded as, quote, oil, smart people, and the will for a better life, the country was unable to put it to use and was unable to recover. Terrorism still plagues the region, and the shadow of the violent uprisings 15 years ago still hangs over North Africa and the Middle East. Gaddafi had plagued Libya for over 40 years and reigned with brutality comparable to some of the most ruthless dictators in history. He had created a totalitarian state that used secret police and security forces to spy on and oppress his own citizens, forcing a fake, heroic image of himself on the public while he hid in seclusion. When the Libyan people finally saw the opportunity to overthrow the authoritarian dictatorship, they were unable to fill in the place with a functional democratic government, and instead the Transitional National Council's government spread the same shallow lies that Gaddafi had, putting on a fake performance for the Western world, while not actually changing anything that mattered. Libya was left vulnerable to foreign influence and the growing influence of ISIS, and was left with 2 rival factions that continued to fight each other since they arose in 2014.